Right, so good evening and welcome everyone. This is the first of a series of educationals we put together, but obviously we can run more on topics as requested as people find things interesting and relevant. But really on this one, we wanted to explore two areas. Why as socialists, as eco-socialists, should we be active in trade unions? And so the first two slides are really more sort of theoretical, discussing those sorts of issues. And the second one is a bit more practical about, well, what do trade unions actually do? Because we think it's also important to talk about that, because while that may be very obvious to some people who have deep experience of being in them and being active in them, for some people, if you work in a non-unionized workplace or you work somewhere where the union isn't really active at all, you actually do want to know, what do unions do? Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? Right, so views of trade unions and their role in society. What do we think they're about? I've put down here a number of things. There's first of all the very obvious ideas around resistance, so they're workers' defence and support groups. That without a union in a workplace, without a union in a workplace, workers are even worse off. That there's this instinctive or natural tendency to form collective organisations at work to represent workers against employers to protect common interests. So we can see them as basic sort of support groups too, where people have got common problems at work. This could often be the initiative, the incentive for getting going when people start to form unions. We can also see them as groups that try to regulate pay and employment conditions, which are in that sense part of an industrial relations system. And obviously the main mechanism whereby trade unions often try to do this is through collective bargaining, but they also try and do it sometimes through seeking relevant legislation to support workers' rights or putting pressure on bad employers through adverse publicity and so on. Historically, unions have also had a role as workers' welfare associations. There's the pluralist view of industrial relations, which sees unions as organisations which balance power in the workplace or balance out, at least to some extent, the power of employers to give workers a fairer perspective and opportunity. There's then also what's seen as the social partnership view, often based on a unitary view of industrial relations in which workers and employers have the same interests, where unions are given a role as partners, junior partners in running capitalism. This is quite common in a lot of the European Union. I mean, in EU parlance, when they talk about social partners, they often mean trade unions and employer representatives. Now, that was quite attractive to trade unions at some times in this country, particularly in the aftermath of Thatcherism and in the times when employers were simply trying to bash or destroy unions. Because the social partnership model gives unions some sort of role, but it's a role which is very much on the terms of managing capitalism better, but with a share of the profits going to the workers. There are then, I think, two other main views of the left we should talk about. One is the syndicalist, or sometimes the anarcho-syndicalist view, a view expressed by organisations in the history of the labour movement like the Industrial Workers of the World. But in this, worker organisations are the basis of social transformation, with the idea of getting all the workers into one big union, having an insurrectionary general strike, taking power that way. So within this view, socialism could be achieved simply through organised labour unions, which recruited all the workers into the union. And then within Marxist views, again, trade unions are very important as mass organisations of workers. They're seen as organisations in which eco-socialists can work, they can build the class struggle, they can build the revolutionary party. But trade unions are not seen as substituting for the revolutionary party. So these are some of the views around which we should be aware of in terms of what are unions for. Can we come to the next slide, please? So why as revolutionaries should be active in trade unions? Well, first of all, obviously some of the understanding of importance of trade unions comes from the Marxist view that the working class isn't just any class, it's a class which is going to be the last ruling class in history, which is the class who has a key role, a central role to play in building socialism. That we see the working class having a particular historic role. And these are the main organisations of the working class, at least in many countries. Also, of course, we want to see the working class continue to exist. There is a basic defence role trade unions perform. and we shouldn't underrate the importance of that at times when the workers' movement comes under attacks in terms of attacks on wages, attacks on living standards, attacks on jobs, and so on. Trade unions are a place of resistance. We are an organisation which has resistance in its title. We are in favour of resistance. It is better to resist than to lie down and let them trample all over you. And if you resist, from the resistance, you can build more, you can build to take power. Another theme that I think is very important for revolutionaries in unions is the defence of union democracy. Though we believe workers' organisations should be democratic, they should not be controlled by the full-time officials or by a narrow elite at the top. They should be democratically controlled by the workers, which means decisions of mass meetings, of branches, of conferences, and so on carried out. And organisations in which union members could debate freely the best way forward for the union. One of the issues, obviously, for socialists around this debate about what are unions for and how do they relate to other organisations of the working class, particularly a workers' party or a revolutionary party, is the question of the distinction between trade union consciousness and class political consciousness, wider class consciousness. A distinction that's obviously very much there in Lenin. But Marx recognised that the experience of workers being brought together in a factory under one roof could be the beginnings of collective consciousness. You see other people in the same situation with the same problems, facing the same issues. You begin to develop some form of class identity. The question is where that goes towards. Is it a basic them and us consciousness, which recognises there are bosses and there are workers and they have different interests, but thinks we're always going to be stuck with that and we just need the unions to defend ourselves? Or does it go further? Does it encompass a vision of a different society? Does it take the sort of Marxist view, the view Lenin talks about very much too in State and Revolution, this idea that the essence of Marxism is not simply recognising that different classes exist, but rather believing that it leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the establishment of a classless society. So there are those issues about how we see that trade union consciousness is something we can build on to achieve a wider consciousness, bringing awareness of equality issues, of internationalism, of the environment, of the class nature of society, and so on. And, for socialists like us, there's the whole question of raising what are called transitional demands. The idea of demands which could go from today's conditions and today's consciousness and lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat. These may be, for instance, demands around workers' control of industry and so on. It's also the case as socialists, we see victories or wins. Well, first of all, we see them as a victory for everybody, not just for the immediate group of workers involved. Because the labour movement often has the slogan, an injury to one is an injury for all, an injury to all. Well, yes, but we also say a victory to one is a victory to all. And we see these as staging posts or steps forward in the class struggle. If workers win things, it gives the confidence to go for further victories. As socialists, we try to build support for eco-socialist, equality and internationalist projects in the unions. And of course, unions are also a place where we hope we will recruit members to ACR and towards building a revolutionary party. So that's a very short summary, but really that's why it's important to be active in the unions if you're in a position where you can be active in a union. Okay, should we go on to the next slide? So what do unions do? This is simply a slide which says that these are the next 5 things I'm going to talk about. So we can go on to the next slide. Right, so this idea of representation is quite an important one for understanding unions, because unions represent workers in a number of different ways. There's representation through individual casework, where you as a union rep accompany a member on a disciplinary or a grievance or a capability procedure or something like this. It's a sort of advocacy role, but it's very important. The rep knows the procedures, puts up a defence or explains the member's grievance. And that basic representation of people means people are not alone, first of all. And often experienced rep can either get people out of difficulties when they might have done something they shouldn't have done or forgotten to do something they ought to have done or something like this. Or they can help reps reps can help members with sorting out problems with, say, a difficult manager, a difficult client, a difficult co-worker, and so on. There are then also consultation processes that often take place in work. Now, consultation means they ask you what you think, but they don't have to agree with you or take any notice of you. Nonetheless, many workplaces have employee consultation committees, joint consultative committees, and so on. Joint because they have representatives of several trade unions often on them. Also, there may be working groups employers set up on particular issues like how do we manage the move to a new site, or how do we have a new model of work planning, or whatever. And unions often represent members on consultation processes, trying to, through advocacy and argument, present the workers' view, but also explain to the management representatives how it would be much better if they ran things in the way the worker representatives suggest. But then there is also collective bargaining or negotiating. And obviously negotiating is better because in negotiating, there is an onus on both sides to reach agreement. Whereas with consultation, management reps can listen to you and then just ignore you. Collective bargaining could take place at a number of levels. It could take place at a local workplace level. It may take place at a national or UK-wide level, where there may be quite an elaborate national bargaining structure. Some of us have been in those, so we can tell you more about it if you're interested. So this is important, representing members through casework, through consultation, through negotiating. And also, lastly, often political lobbying, e.g. lobbying for funding for a sector, or lobbying for some reform in employment law which would benefit your members. So parliamentary lobbying, sometimes lobbying councils too, is also an activity unions engage in. So there's actually quite a broad spectrum of representative work. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Collective bargaining. In countries like Britain, in a number of advanced industrial countries, collective bargaining is often the heart of what unions do. Now, there are two types of agreements in terms of collective bargaining. There are what are called procedural agreements. These involve recognising a union as the bargaining agent and establishing the rules about bargaining, like who are you bargaining with. They also sometimes define the employer, which is actually quite important because sometimes it's not clear in the public sector just who your employer is. They also provide something called union facility time. That's paid time off for union representatives to do their trade union work in work time. Then there are what are called substantive agreements, which cover things like pay, pensions, conditions of employment, what you get for your work and what you have to do in return. There are also procedural agreements around workplace procedures, like how the employer would deal with issues of capability when someone is suspected of not being able to do the job. What happens about discipline, redundancy, redeployment, restructuring of the workplace. These agreements are important because it means employers can't just do things to people. They have to follow certain procedures. And that means that gives unions space to organise and to object to what employers are trying to do to people. As I've already said, bargaining can be at a local level or at a national level. The other thing that's very important to say about collective bargaining is the relationship between collective bargaining and industrial action. Any trade unionist who's negotiated at times when they've got a live ballot behind them, and at times when they haven't, can just almost feel the difference in their bones. If you have a live ballot, the employers actually negotiate, they listen. If there's the threat of industrial action happening, if they don't make some movement, they then make some movement on pay or other matters. If you are simply negotiating without a live ballot, you obviously do what you can for your members through reasoned argument, but the amount of interest a lot of employers show in reasoned argument or shed loads of supporting statistics is often quite limited. So it's important to explain to members that collective bargaining is something elected representatives do on members' behalf. But all members are involved because if members are willing to take industrial action to back up a bargaining position, it makes a real difference to what the unions can actually deliver for members through the collective bargaining process. So it's very much important to think about the union as everybody, not just the elected reps who are sent in to talk to the management. Because when it comes to industrial action, and we'll look at that more in a further sort of session, it's actually all members who need to be involved to make it effective, to be on the picket lines, to be getting people out to vote for strike action or other forms of sanctions, and so on. Okay, next slide, please. Another thing that's an important issue, and sometimes an area where people get active in unions, first of all, is a trade union safety representative. Trade unions do have elected safety representatives. They have legal rights under the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974, like the right to carry out inspections of the workplace. And they are legally entitled to on a statutory basis to paid time off for their trade union duties as a health and safety rep. And it's important to understand that health and safety is a big trade union issue. I mean, there's a magazine, Hazards, which deals with health and safety at work. Because from a trade union perspective, we don't believe there are accidents at work. Accidents are preventable. If it's oil on the floor or lack of a guard on the machinery or exposure of workers to hazardous substances. This isn't an accident or stress through impossible workloads. That's also a health and safety issue. This isn't an accident. It's something employers have let happen because they didn't care enough. And that's why it's very important for unions to organise around health and safety. I mean, this was quite important during the COVID pandemic, for instance, because there is a right under the health and safety at work legislation to just walk off the workplace if jobs are unsafe. And certainly the school teachers union, the NEU, was quite proactive in using that, in pushing for schools to be closed in the early period of the COVID pandemic. So health and safety is a big issue. We've got some comrades who are working, for instance, on the problem of long COVID and campaigns around that. But it's important to understand this is an issue for trade unions. It's not just a technical specialism. Okay, next one, please. Another thing that's important that's been happening in the trade unions, and particularly I think should interest us as eco-socialists, is the way some unions are electing green reps and have networks of green reps. I mean, like my own union, UCU's got a network for green reps. They have an annual meeting and so on. And green reps could take up a whole number of environmental issues in the workplace, things like quality of air. Some of it can overlap with health and safety, obviously. Unions are developing the idea of green bargaining as part of their collective bargaining range of work, including environmental demands like making the workplace greener, doing more recycling at work. Also challenging things like, why do the chief executives need to make these luxury trips to and overseas visits? Is that really necessary? It can also, of course, raise issues about how do we produce, how do we do our work? I mean, within UCU, within our green bargaining demands, we've been including demands about the academic curriculum, including issues about the climate emergency, about how to tackle climate change, about, how to develop and train people for green jobs, things like this. So this is, again, quite another important area of the work. We could have a specialist session on it later if people are interested. But this idea of green bargaining is something unions have been looking at this for a couple of decades now. Okay, you might feel they've not achieved much. But I mean, for instance, one of the leading trade unionists at one time, Sharon Barrow, who was General Secretary of the National Trade Union Confederation, said, look, there are no jobs on a dead planet. In that sense, it's an absolutely critical issue for trade unions. And the issue of just transition from jobs in fossil fuel production, jobs which damage the environment, to green jobs, is a really important issue for some unions. One of the problems at the moment is there isn't a statutory entitlement to trade union facility time, to paid time off for union work for green reps, although we did put that in our eco-socialism manifesto as a demand. Whereas there is that demand, there is that right rather for health and safety reps. It's also important to talk about trade unions doing quite a lot of educational and welfare work. So unions provide a lot of education courses. For some people, this can be very much an opportunity for some groups of workers to get education that didn't happen for them in their school days. Unions have people who are called union learning reps, who have a role which is partly about encouraging learning in the workplace. It doesn't have to be only learning related to doing the job. It can be broader. Trade unions also provide a lot of education courses, both within the union, but also TUC accredited courses, which are sometimes taught in FE colleges, although that level of educational provision has been coming under attack. Things like basic courses about how to be a shop steward, how to be a health and safety rep, how to organise various things, how to be a green rep. UCU's got some courses coming up for green reps, for instance. So trade unions also do quite a bit of educational work. They also traditionally had a welfare role. Obviously, perhaps less an issue if we have a welfare state, but if we have a welfare state is perhaps the way to formulate it at the moment. So some unions have benevolent funds which help members who are in financial difficulties. They run convalescent homes and so on. Unions have been involved in supporting members in those various ways. There's also an aspect to union membership, which is sometimes used in literature promoting unions and so on, about various benefits negotiated by unions for their members, whether it's cheaper house or car insurance or various concessions of that sort. So there's also that area of union work. I think we're just about getting through a brief summary of what unions do. What's our next slide? Is it the references? Yes, just a couple of suggestions for reading. The book by John Kelly on trade unions and socialist politics. Well, Kelly isn't exactly from the same political stable as us, is, however, a useful summary of a lot of the debates. There is the book published by Pathfinder Press in 1975 by Leon Trotsky, about Leon Trotsky's writings on the trade unions, which actually gives you a much broader view than simply what's in the transitional program about what Trotsky had to say around the unions.